a strange title and has the joint or the simultaneous characteristics of being apparently somewhat narrow and at the same time terribly bold. It seems to be narrow in being apparently addressed to Jews, why we remain Jews, and why it is a bold sounding title, I suppose, hardly needs to be spelled out, since it suggests that a question remains as to why people should continue to be Jews, something which, as Jews, perhaps you'd expect they'd never raise as a question. Now, as it happens, the boldness of this fundamental question is connected with breadth of it, I think. It's not a narrow question, as it will turn out, because the problem seems to arise in virtue of some very deep and far-ranging developments coming from modern science and modern politics. Some developments in modern political life seem to cause a special difficulty for people when they consider their Jewish character, and indeed, which is what makes the question somewhat more than narrow, when they consider the question of their religious affiliation at all. And I think that since the question does so much have to do with developments coming from modern science and modern political life, the question is one that probably occurs not only to Jews, but also to people of every religious persuasion. Now, I am absolutely uncommissioned to speak for any of the subsequent lecturers, and I don't in any way wish to appear to anticipate what they might say, but it would surprise me very much if it didn't turn out to be true that in one way or another the lectures will speak to the question that arises in the mind of everybody, not only of a Jew, and can easily be transformed with some modifications into the question why anybody should remain anything that he happens to be to begin with. Now, one other consideration might deserve to be mentioned. Not only is the title of this series a bit bold in its appearance, but you might also have been somewhat taken aback by the extensive affiliation of the political science department with the discussion of this question. As to whether that contributes another element of boldness, I will have to allow you to judge on hearing what is forthcoming. This is one of those occasions on which it literally is true that the speaker needs no introduction. Everybody, I think, knows the reputation of the gentleman whom we will now have the pleasure to hear. I will only say that it's a source of very great personal pleasure, and it would be an honor to anybody who is in a position of introducing the Robert Maynard Hutchins Distinguished Service Professor of Political Science, Dr. Leo Strauss.
Mr. Chairman, ladies and gentlemen, I have to make two prefatory remarks. One was partly anticipated by Dr. Cropsey regarding the title. When Rabbi Pekarski approached me first and suggested this title, I was repelled by it, not to say shocked by it. But then on reflection I found one could say something about it. And at any rate, I must say, to the extent to which I prepared this paper, I prepared it on the assumption that I was going to speak on the subject, why do we remain Jews? I learned of the subtitle only a few days ago when, thanks to some mishap in the printing division of Hillel Foundation, I saw for the first time the subtitle, on which I could not with propriety speak, because after all, everyone is a specialist, and my specialty is to use a very broad and non-specialist name, social science rather than divinity. Now, social science demands from us that we all know And the gentlemen from the social science division I see here, are some of very different persuasions than I, would agree with me that it's a characteristic of the social sciences to start from solid, if low, facts, and to remain as much as possible on that ground. No flights of fancy, no science fiction, no metaphysics will enter. That is clear. The second point which I have to make in my introduction is of a more private nature, and I'm sad to have to say that I could not prepare this lecture for entirely private reasons as I would have wished to prepare it. Nevertheless, I didn't cancel the lecture because I thought I am prepared, if not indeed for this lecture, but for the subject. I believe I can say without any exaggerations that since a very, very early time, the main theme of my reflections has been what is called the Jewish questions. May I only mention a single fact, going very far back in my childhood. I believe I was about 5 or 6 years old in some very small German town, not to say a village. I saw in my father's house refugees from Russia after some pogroms which had happened there, women, children, old men, on their way to Australia. At that time it could not happen in Germany. We Jews there lived in profound peace with our non-Jewish neighbors. There was a government, not in every respect perhaps admirable, but keeping an admirable order everywhere. And such things as pogroms would have been absolutely impossible. Nevertheless, this story which I heard made a very deep impression on me, which I have not forgotten until the present day. It was an unforgettable moment. I sensed for a moment that it could happen here. That was overlaid soon by other pleasing experiences, but it went to my bones, if I may say so. Now, since this and many other experiences, which would be absolutely boring and improper to rehearse, are the basis of my lecture, you will not expect a lucid presentation. On the other hand, I will promise to give, as I indicated by the reference to the fact that I'm a social scientist, what one would call a hard-boiled one. I prefer to call it a frank one. I will not beat around the bush in any respect. At the same time, I hope that I can reconcile what not necessarily all social scientists do, the avoiding of beating around the bush, with a treatment which we would call kavod, or to translate it, honorable. I think that should be possible. Now I turn to my subject. The main title, taken by itself, implies that we could not remain Jews, that there might be good reasons for not remaining Jews. It suggests even this possibility. The clearest expression of this view, of this premise, was given by Heinrich Heine, the well-known poet. Judaism is not a religion, but a misfortune. The conclusions from this premise are obvious. Let us get rid of it as fast as we can and as painlessly as we can. If I may now use a somewhat almost technical word, complete assimilation is the only help. Now, this solution to the problem was always possible. For it was always suggested somehow, because at all times it was very difficult to be a Jew. Think of the Middle Ages, think of the Reformation, to say nothing of other times. In a way, even, that solution was easier in the past than it is now. It was sufficient in the Christian countries for a Jew to convert to Christianity. And therewith he ceased to be a Jew. And we cannot count, and no statistician will ever be able to find out how many Jews took this easy way out of what Heine calls misfortune. Yet, there were difficulties here. I will not speak of certain obvious things like the separation of the only people one knew well, one's family. But there was a big experiment made. And that was in Spain after 1492, when the Jews were expelled from Spain. What I say about these things is, of course, entirely due to authorities. I have no own knowledge in these matters, but a very solid authority whom I will refer later. Spain was the first country in which Jews felt at home, although they knew they were in exile. And therefore the expulsion from Spain was an infinitely greater misfortune for the Spanish Jews than the expulsion from France in 1340, if I remember well, and the expulsion of the Jews from England in 1290, so and so. Well, and so quite a few Jews simply could not tear themselves away from Spain. And this difficulty was enhanced if the individuals in question were wealthy, had large possessions, especially landed possessions, and some of them, some leaders of Jewish communities, converted to Christianity. And they lived in Spain. But this time it was different, because there were so many converts at the same time, and not one here and another there. As a consequence, there was a reaction to these many new Christians. And the reaction showed itself in distrust to them. Many Christians thought that these converts were not sincere believers in Christianity, but simply had preferred their earthly fortunes to their faith. The Inquisition entered and did all kinds of things which are most horrible to read. But of course, in some cases, if the Inquisition did its worst, it could not give a legal proof of the fact that someone, former Jew, had engaged in Jewish practices or whatever it may be, and so quite a few survived. But one thing was done, which was extra legal but not illegal. The Spaniards made a distinction between the old Christians and the new Christians. And they began to speak of Spaniards of pure blood, the old Spaniards, and by implication of the Spaniards of impure blood, meaning the conversos, the Jews who had converted to Christianity, the anusim, as we call them. Now, this is of course ancient history. Assimilation now does not mean conversion to Christianity, as we know, because assimilation now is assimilation to a secular society, a society which is not legally a Christian society, a society beyond the difference between Judaism and Christianity. And in this sense, if every religion is a particular religion, Judaism, Christianity, Islam, and so on, and a religious society, a secular society, a liberal society. In such a society, there are no longer any legal disabilities of Jews as Jews, as we know. But a liberal society stands and falls by the distinction between the political or the state and society. or by the distinction between the public and the private. In a liberal society, there is necessarily a private sphere with which the state legislation does not interfere. And it is an essential element of this liberal society with its essential distinction between the public and the private, that religion, as a particular religion, not as general religiousness, is private. Every citizen is free to adhere to any religion he sees fit. Now, given this, the necessary existence of such a private sphere, liberal society necessarily makes possible, permits, and even fosters what is called by many people discrimination. And here in this well-known fact, the Jewish problem, if I may call it this way, reappears. There are restricted areas, and in various ways, I do not have to labor this point. Any glance at the Journal of Sociology or at Jewish journals would convince you of the fact if you have any doubt about its existence. Therefore, the practical problem for the individual Jew on the low and solid ground is this: how can I escape discrimination? A term which I beg you to understand always is used with a quotation mark, because I would not use it of my own free will. Now the answer is simple: by ceasing to be recognizable as a Jew. There are certain rules of that which everyone can guess, I would say, a priori, and I wouldn't be surprised if there were not an Landers or another writer of this kind who had written perhaps a long list of these techniques. The most well-known are change of names, mixed marriages, childless marriages. It would be a worthy subject for a sociological study to enlarge this theme and to exhaust it if possible. I do not have to go into that because it is not truly important, because this solution is possible at the most only for individuals here or there, not for large groups. I once heard the story of Jews in Los Angeles, of some Jews, who tried to solve this discrimination problem by becoming Christian Scientists. And there were first 4, then there were 10, and then more. And then at a certain moment, the chairman of that group, or I don't know whether they called him chairman, said, well, that is all very nice, but why don't you make another group, a group of your own, of Christian Scientists, meaning of former Jews. So in simply, I think we can leave it as well. I would say this possibility is refuted by a very simple statistical phenomenon, not known to me statistically, but only by observation, the Jewish birth rate. A broad solution would require the legal prohibition against discrimination in every manner, shape, or form. And I have seen people, Jews, who thought just we wanted that. Fraternities must not be permitted to pick their own people, and strictly speaking, no man can pick his own company. The prohibition against every discrimination would mean the abolition of the private sphere, the denial of the difference between state and society. In a word, the destruction of liberal society. And therefore it is not a sensible objective of policy. But some people would say, well, why not the destruction of liberal society if this is the only way in which we can get the abolition of discrimination, or what they call the abolition of injustice? Now, we have empirical data about this fact, the abolition of liberal society and how it affects the fate of Jews. And that was done on a large scale in a famous country, a very large country, unfortunately a very powerful country called Russia. You all are familiar with the fact that the policy of communism is of the communist government and not of private fraternity-like and other organizations, is anti-Jewish. To which one could reply, well, that is undoubtedly the fact. I made some checks on it. I mean, I get some information from certain associations, but I asked a gentleman whom I know very well, a friend of mine, who is very much in favor of an arrangement with Soviet Russia. He is a Jew. And I asked him, what did you observe about Jews, Soviet Russia? He wasn't Muslim. And he said, of course, it's true. Jews are naturally discriminated against as a matter of principle by the government. And he gave me some specimens. So it's no question that this is a fact. But someone would say, all right, that is maybe the policy of the present Russian government. It is not essential to communism. There could, in other words, it is thinkable to abolish liberal society, to abolish the difference between state and society, without having afterward a more anti-Jewish policy than exists anywhere in the present West. I would like to discuss this objection. It is not essential to communism to be anti-Jewish. I would say it is very uncommunistic to seek for the essence of communism outside of what they call the historic reality of communism, in a mere ideal or aspiration. Trotsky's communism, which was different, which was surely not anti-Jewish in this sense, has been refuted by his highest authority, history. And the Trotskyite is, a living, not only contradiction, but manifest contradiction. There is no longer a Western revolutionary proletariat, to put it on a somewhat broader basis, and that settles this issue perfectly. Only thanks to Stalin could the communist revolution survive. Stalin was a wiser statesman from this point of view than Trotsky and to some extent than Lenin, by demanding socialism in a single country. Only thanks to Stalin could the communist revolution survive Hitler. But in order to survive Hitler, Stalin had to learn from Hitler. That is always so. In order to defeat an enemy, you have to take a leaf from his book. Stalin learned two grave lessons from Hitler. The first, which has nothing directly to do with our issue, but should be mentioned, is that bloody purges of fellow revolutionaries are not only possible, but eminently helpful. The old communist theory, as you surely know, was no repetition of the bad experience of the French Revolution, where the revolution eats its own children, under no circumstances. And then Hitler showed by his classic acts against Rome that this can be done and makes governing much easier. So, number one, the big Stalin purges were all afterward. Secondly, and here I come back to our immediate subject, in pre-First World War socialism, where the distinction between Bolshevism and Menshevism was not so visible, at least not in the Western countries, it was an axiom, I quote, anti-Semitism is a socialism of the fools, unquote, and therefore incompatible with intelligent socialism. But again, Hitler showed something. And I think one can state the lesson which Hitler gave to Stalin very simply as follows. The fact that anti-Semitism is a socialism of the fools is an argument not against, but for anti-Semitism, given the fact that there is such an abundance of fools. Why should one not steal that very profitable thunder? Of course, one must not become like that great fool Hitler, a prisoner of these things. I mean, so that you see nothing but anti-Jewish things. That is absurd. But judiciously used, judiciously used, politically used, anti-Jewish policies make governing Russians and Ukrainians and so on much easier than if one would be really strictly fair to Jews. I do not have to point out the obvious fact that we must think not only of the Russians and Ukrainians, but also of the Arabs. And everyone can easily see that there are many more Arabs in the world than there are Jews. I mean, a sober statesman for whom the end sanctifies every means has no choice. Khrushchev, I think one can say, abandoned lesson number 1 regarding the desirability and usefulness of bloody purges of fellow party members, for the time being, let me add, but he surely kept lesson B. And it is here has come to stay. I draw a conclusion for the time being. It is impossible not to remain a Jew. It is impossible to run away from one's origins. It is impossible to get rid of one's past by wishing it away. There is nothing better than the uneasy solution offered by liberal society, which means legal equality plus private discrimination. We must simply recognize the fact, which we all know, that the Jewish minority is not universally popular, and the consequences which follow from that. We all know that there is in this country an entirely extra-legal, but not illegal, what we can call racial hierarchy, coming down from the Anglo-Saxons down to the Negroes, and we are just above the Negroes. We must face that, and we must see that there is a similarity between the Jewish and the Negro question. But and there are quite a few Jewish organizations which are very well aware of it, but also, in order to keep the record straight, we must not forget the difference. When we Jews fight for something which we may generally call justice, we appeal to principles ultimately, which, if I may say so, were our own. Bible. When the Negroes fight for justice, they have to appeal to principles which were not their own, their ancestors in Africa, but which they learned from their oppressors. This is a not altogether negligible difference, which should, however, be stated by someone who doesn't want to beat around the bush. I begin again with another round. There is no solution to the Jewish problem. The expectation of such that solution is due to the premise every problem can be solved. There was a famous writer, a great mathematician in the 16th century, that I also read somewhere, I haven't read that man, Vieta, who has literally said there is no problem which cannot be solved. And this is, as of course in application to social matters, a premise of many well-meaning men in the West in the 19th, 20th century. I disagree with them entirely. It is not self-evident that every problem can be solved, and therefore we should not be altogether surprised if the Jewish problem cannot be solved. Let us briefly survey the solutions which have been suggested. The first is the assimilation of individuals, of which I disposed before. The second would be assimilation in a different form. Judaism to understood as a sect, like any other sect. I say advisedly sect and not religion. A society that is based on an entirely voluntary membership. So that today you belong to sect A, you change your mind, you leave sect A and turn to sect B, and the same applies, of course, to all members of your family. The fact that one stems from Jewish parents would be entirely irrelevant from this point of view. I do not believe that this opinion can be reconciled with anything ever understood by Jewish, regardless of whether it is Orthodox, conservative, or Reform. There is a third solution, the only one which hitherto mentioned, which deserves our serious attention. And that is assimilation as a nation. Here, the fact that the Jews are an ethnic group is honestly faced. But it is also implied that Judaism is a misfortune. Implied. Judaism is a misfortune, and we must do something, we must solve that problem. But the problem cannot be solved except on a national scale. We Jews are a nation like any other nation. And just as any other nation, we have the right to demand self-determination. It leads necessarily to the demand for a Jewish state. This was the view taken by the strictly political Zionism. I emphasize the word strictly because in empirical fact there are all kinds of combinations, by no means due to accident, but to one of the deepest principles of human nature, which is that man is an animal who wishes to have the cake and to eat it. To make clear what I mean, I remind you of the motto of the most impressive early statement of political Zionism, that is Pinska's Auto-Emancipation, written in the 80s of the last century. Pinska's motto is this: if I am not for myself, who will I be? And if not now, when? Don't expect help from others, and don't postpone your work for a solution indefinitely. This is a quotation from a well-known Jewish book, The Sayings of the Fathers. But in the original, something else is said which Pinska omitted. But if I'm only for myself, what am I? The omission of that, I think one can say, constitutes the definition of pure-blooded political Zionism. There was, long before Pinska, a man who sketched the principle of political Zionism, a great man, but not a good Jew, and that was Spinoza. Towards the end of the third chapter of Theological Political Treatise, he says, I'm calling now from memory, if the principles of their religion did not effeminate the Jews, I would regard it as perfectly possible that one day, if the political constellation is favorable, they might succeed in restoring their estate. I don't believe he said Palestine, because from his point of view, Uganda would have been as good as Palestine. Now, because I did not interpret this very interesting utterance of Spinoza, what he means by the effeminating character of the Jewish religion, which is very austere, as you doubtless know, but he meant simply, by effeminating, he meant trust in God, instead of trust in one's friend guns and other hardware. But in spite of the undeniable fact that political Zionism, pure and simple, is based on a radical break with the principles of the Jewish tradition, I cannot leave that subject without paying it homage. Political Zionism was more passionately and more soberly concerned with the human dignity of the Jews. What it had in mind ultimately was that the Jews should return to their land with their heads up, koma miyut, but not by virtue of divine act, but by virtue of political and military action, fighting. It is political Zionism, whatever one may say against it, on this grounds as well as on the other ground that for simple demographic reasons it is impossible to settle all Jews in that very small land and other things of this kind. The political Zionism was a very honorable suggestion. But one must add, it is also merely formal or poor. I would like to illustrate this. I was myself, as you might have guessed, a political scientist in my youth and was a member of a student organization and so on. And in this capacity, I met occasionally Jabotinsky. You know who Jabotinsky was? The leader of the revisionists. And I visited him, and he asked me, "What are you doing?" And I said, "Well, we read Bible, we study Jewish history, we have Zionist theory, and of course, keep abreast of developments." He said, "Rifle practice?" And I had to say no, which was, of course, a very great inconsistency on our part. Now, in this group, when I talk to my friends, some are now very high officials in Israel, I made this observation. They were really passionate Zionists. Political scientists worked very much and were filled with enthusiasm. But after all, you cannot always make speeches and have political discussions or do other administrative work. You also have to have, so to say, a life of your own. And I was struck by the fact that some of these very estimable young men, the substance of their intellectual life, to the extent to which it was not merely academic, and therefore of no particular interest outside of the academic halls, they were concerned with people like Balzac. I remember that distinctly. But it could also have been Stendhal or Dostoevsky, I don't care. But the main point is, the Zionism was strictly limited to political action. The mind was in no way employed, or the heart was in no way employed in matters Jewish. Now this led to a reaction very early, an opposition to political Zionism by cultural Zionism. Cultural Zionism means simply that it is not enough to have a Jewish state. The state must also have a Jewish culture, a Jewish culture. In other words, it cannot live on the novels of France or other countries. It must have a life of its own. A Jewish culture means the product of the Jewish mind in contradistinction to other national minds. Now, if we look at, however, at what this means in specific terms, we see that, of course, the rock bottom of any Jewish culture are the Bible, Talmud, and Midrash. And this, if you take these things with a minimum of respect or seriousness, you must say they were not meant to be products of the Jewish mind. They were meant to be ultimately Torah min hashamayim, the Torah from heaven. And this is the crux, the fatal difficulty for cultural Zionism. Judaism cannot be understood as it is as a culture. I mean, of course, there are folk dances and pottery and all that, but you can't live on that. The substance is not culture, but divine revelation. And therefore the only consistent solution, real solution, is that which abandons, which goes beyond cultural Zionism and becomes clearly religious Zionism. Return to the Jewish faith, to the faith of our ancestors. But here we are up against the difficulty which is underlying the very title of the lecture and everything I said before. What shall those Jews do who cannot believe as our ancestors believed? So while religious Zionism is the only clear solution, it is not feasible, humanly speaking, for all Jews. I repeat, it is impossible to get rid of one's past. It is necessary to accept one's past. That means out of this undeniable necessity, one must make a virtue. The virtue in question is fidelity, loyalty, piety in the old Latin sense of the word pietas. The necessity of taking this step appears from the disgraceful character of the only alternative, of denying one's origin, past or heritage. A solution of a man's problem, which can be achieved only through a disgraceful act, is a disgraceful solution. But let us be detached, let us be objective, scientific. Is this universally true? Let us take, and we should really bust the case wide open, and in order to understand the difficulty. I'm not interested in preaching up any solution. I try to help myself, and if I can, some of you, in understanding our difficulty. Let us take a man by nature well gifted for all excellences of man, of the mind and of the soul, who stems from the gutter. Is he not entitled to run away from the gutter? Surely. One could even say that by being silent about his gutter origins, he acts more decently than by displaying them and thus annoying others with a bad smell. Yet, however this may be, this interesting case, which deserves all our compassion, I think, is surely not our case. Our worst enemies admit this in one way or another. Our worst enemies are now called, since I don't know how many years, anti-Semites, a word which I shall never use, which I regard as almost obscene, and I think if we are sensible, we abolish it from our usage. This was coined, as I learned a few weeks ago. I said in a former speech here, it was coined by some German or French pedant. I smell that. But then I learned it was coined by a German peasant, a fellow called Marr, M-A-R-R. Now the reason was very simple. Anti-Semitism means hatred of Jews. We Jews have a similar word, we call it rishut, viciousness, and which is not a bad word at all, but which is of course not easily intelligible by non-Jews, and therefore we have to have a translation for that. But hatred of Jews is perfectly intelligible. It was coined in a situation in which people could no longer justify their hatred of Jews by saying the Jews are not Christians. Yeah? not Christians. That was a traditional end form of anti-Jewish conduct. They had to find another reason, and since the 19th century was almost as proud of science as the 20th century, it had to be scientific reason. And science proved that the whole Western world consisted of two races, fundamental races, Aryan and Semitic race, and therefore, by calling it anti-Semitism, you could say, having great authorities, Renan and some others, and say, well, we act on a spiritual principle, not on just mere hatred. The difficulty, of course, is that the Arabs are also Semites, among others, and one of my Arab friends was occasionally asked in the Chicago suburb, you are, of course, an anti-Semite, and he had to say, no, I can't do it. It is an absurd thing. So I speak of our enemies, and I want to show that they recognize that we are not from the gutter. Let us take the latest and crudest and simplest example, the Nazis. The Nazi system was based on the notion of the Aryan. I mean, it was no longer a Christian Germany. It was to be an Aryan Germany. Now, what does Aryan mean? Aryan does not mean what Renan and some linguists and so would understand by Aryan, but Aryan has to be defined for practical terms. And the Nazis were simply compelled to give the Japanese, for example, the status of Aryans, and quite a few others. In a word, Aryan had no meaning other but non-Jewish. Now, if the Nazi regime was the only regime of which I know which was based on no principle other than the negation of Jews, therewith it could not define its highest objective except by putting the Jews into the center. That is a great compliment to us, not intended as such. I take more serious cases. In late classical antiquity, we, and incidentally also the Christians, but I speak only of us, were accused of the pagan Romans of being convicted of hatred of the human race. Convicted of I forget minor and trivial things. Convicted of hatred of the human race. I contend that was a very high compliment, and I will try to prove it. This accusation reflects an undeniable fact. For the human race consists of many nations or tribes, or in Hebrew, goyim. A nation is a nation by virtue of what it looks up to. In antiquity, a nation was a nation by virtue of its looking up to its gods. They did not have ideologies at that time. They did not have even ideals at that time. At the top, there were the gods. And now our ancestors asserted a priori, that's to say without looking at any of these gods, that these gods were nothings and abominations. That the highest of any nation was nothings and abominations. In the light I cannot develop now, then we would have to go into that metaphysical science fiction thing which I try to avoid, but I must at least make one remark. In the light of the purity which Josiah understood when he said of himself, a man of unclean lips in the midst of a nation of unclean lips, the very Parthenon is impure. This is still alive in Judaism today, not among all Jews, but among some. I heard the story when Ben Gurion went to Thailand for negotiations or so. He went to a Buddhist temple, And there was quite an uproar in Israel about that, the old grounds. And I suggested to the man who told me he should have prior to Ben Gurion that he should say what he was meditating upon in that Buddhist temple was the foreign policy of Israel, which might be pleaded as an attenuating circumstance. Now, the fight of our ancestors against Rome was unique. We have the two greatest cases, the Jewish fight against Rome and the German fight against Rome. So the Germans were more successful from a military point of view. They defeated the Romans. We were defeated. Yet still, victory and defeat is not the highest criterion. And if we compare these two actions, we see that the fight of our ancestors was not merely a fight against foreign oppression, but it was a fight in the name of what one should very provisionally call an idea. The only fight in the name of an idea made against the Roman Empire. The next great anti-Jewish body was the Christian Republic. The hatred of Jews persisted but changed. In some respects it was even intensified. For the Jewish people's posture towards the God-man was the same as that against the man-like God of the Greeks and Romans. And the most, since there are many Christians today are no longer Trinitarians, one difference surely remains between Judaism and Christianity, which was never taken back. The Christian assertion, the Redeemer has come, was always countered by our ancestors to the assertion, the Redeemer has not come. One can perhaps say, and I say this without any animus, that the justification of Judaism in its fight with Christianity was supplied by the Crusades. One only has to read that history as a Jew to be satisfied with the fact that one is a Jew. The Crusades consisted partly of a simple orgy of murder of Jews. Wherever the Crusaders went, above all in Jerusalem itself, how did our ancestors act? Permit me to read a few lines from a writing of the greatest living Jewish historian, Yitzhak F. Beer, Galut. The best descriptions left us of the persecutions that took place at the time of the First Crusade are to be found in Hebrew records. These were constructed from shorter reports describing the happenings in individual places and provinces, and encountered similar pamphlets with opposite tendencies that were circulated by the Christians. In this age, religious national martyrdom reaches its highest expression. These martyrs are no seekers after death, like the early Christians, no heroes challenging destiny. Violence and death come unsought, and the whole community suffers, old and young, women and children, willing or not. At first they fight for the preservation of the community, and they hold off their enemies before the walls of the episcopal palace or the fortress, just as long as defense is possible. One must add here a remark, which Bear of course does not deny, that the higher clergy behaved on the whole much better than the lower clergy. You know, the peasant sons who had become priests were much more fanatic and savage than the famous case of Bernard de Clairvaux, who tried to prevent that, but they did not prevail. But then, when all hope for safety is gone, they are ready for martyrdom. No scene is more stirring than the Sabbath meal of the pious Jews in Xanten, Renania, 1096. Hardly had the grace before the meal been recited when the news came of the enemy's approach. Immediately they fulfilled the ceremony of the closing grace, recited the formula expressing faith in the oneness of God, and carried out the terrible act of sacrifice that was renewed again and again, generation after generation, from the time of Masada in the Roman wars. The martyrology have described in frightful clarity the ritual of voluntary mutual slaughter, not the sacrifice of enemies falsely ascribed to the Jews, and have glorified it in poetry modeled after the sacrifice of Isaac, Akedat Yitzchak. The Reformation abolished bloody persecution, but the unbloody persecution which remained was in some respects worse than the bloody persecution of the Middle Ages, because it did not call forth the fighting qualities which were still so powerfully visible in that glorious time for us of the Crusades. I summarize. Our past, our heritage, our origin is then not misfortune, as Heine said, still less baseness, but suffering indeed, heroic suffering. Suffering stemming from the heroic act of self-dedication of a whole nation to something which it regarded as infinitely higher than itself, in fact, as the infinitely highest. No Jew can do anything better for himself today than to live in remembering this past. But someone might say, is this sufficient if the old faith has gone? Must the Jews who cannot believe what his ancestors believed not admit to himself that his ancestors dedicated themselves to a delusion, if to the noblest of all delusions? Must he not dedicate himself to life in a world which is no longer Jewish, and by the same token no longer Christian, but, as one could say, post-Judeo-Christian? However repulsive the thought of assimilation must be to any proud man, must he not accept assimilation as a moral necessity and not as a convenience? Is not the noblest in man his capacity to assimilate himself to the truth? Very well. Let us then reconsider assimilation. We will be helped in that reconsideration in a statement by a non-Jew, by a German. By a German, in addition, who has a very bad reputation in many quarters, and that is Friedrich Nietzsche. I would like to read to you an aphorism, which will not please every one of you, from Nietzsche's Dawn of Day, aphorism 205. The people of Israel. The translation is not good. I mean, this man had no sense of language. I have tried to make some corrections while I went, but not enough. The people of Israel. One of the spectacles which the next century will invite us to witness is a decision regarding the fate of the European Jews. It is quite obvious now that they have cast their die and crossed their Rubicon. The only thing that remains for them is either to become masters of Europe or to lose Europe, as they once centuries ago lost Egypt, where they were confronted with a similar either-or. In Europe, however, they have gone through a schooling of 18 centuries, such as no other nation has ever undergone here, And the experiences of this dreadful time of training have benefited not only the community, but even to a greater extent the individual. As a consequence, the resourcefulness of the modern Jews, both in mind and soul, is extraordinary. Amongst all the inhabitants of Europe, it is the Jews least of all who try to escape from any distress by recourse to drink or to suicide, as the less gifted are so prone to do. Every sociologist knows that regarding suicide, situation has terribly changed. That was still the old sturdy Jews of human history. Every Jew can find in the history of his own family and of his ancestors a treasure, and refusing them access to all honors and everything honorable. And by pushing them further down into the more sordid traits, and under this process indeed, they have not become any cleaner, but contemptible. They have never ceased for a moment from believing themselves qualified for the very highest things, nor have the virtues of the sufferers ever ceased to adorn them. The manner in which they honor their parents and children, old time, forgotten times, the reasonableness of their marriages and marriage customs, tempora mutantur, this distinguishes them amongst all Europeans. Besides this, they have been able to create for themselves a sense of power and eternal vengeance from the very traits that were left to them, or to which they were left. Even in palliation of their usury, we cannot help saying that without this occasional pleasant and useful torture inflicted on their enemies, they would have experienced difficulty in preserving their self-respect for so long. For our self-respect depends upon our ability to make reprisals in both good and evil. Nevertheless, their revenge never urges them on too far, for they all have that liberality of mind and even of soul, produced in men by frequent changes of place, climate, and customs of neighbors and oppressors. They possess by far the greatest experience in all human intercourse, and even in their passion, they exercise a caution which this experience has developed in them. They are so certain of their intellectual versatility and shrewdness that they never, even when reduced to the direst straits, have to earn their bread by manual labor as common workmen, porters, or farmhands. Well, he knew only German Jews. In their manners we can still see that they have never been inspired by chivalric feelings, or that their bodies have never ever been girt with fine weapons. A certain obtrusiveness alternates with a submissiveness which is often tender and almost always painful. Now, however, that they unavoidably intermarry more and more, year after year, with the noblest blood of Europe, they will soon have a considerable heritage of good manners of the mind and the body, so that in another 100 years they will have a sufficiently noble aspect not to render themselves as masters disgraceful to those whom will be their subjects. And this is important, and therefore a settlement of the question is still premature. They themselves know very well that the conquest of Europe or any act of violence is not to be thought of. But they also know that some day or other Europe may, like a ripe fruit, fall into the hands which extend themselves towards it only a bit. In the meantime, it is necessary for them to distinguish themselves in all departments of European distinction and to stand in the front rank until they shall have advanced so far as to determine themselves what distinction shall mean. Then they will be called the inventors and guides of the Europeans, whose shame they will no longer offend. And then, where shall an outlet be found for this abundance of great impressions, accumulated during such an extended period, and representing Jewish history for every Jewish family, this wealth of passions, virtues, resolutions, resignations, struggles, and victories of all kinds? Where can it find an outlet but in great intellectual men and works? On the day when the Jews will be able to exhibit to us as their own work such jewels and golden vessels as no European nation, with its shorter and less profound experience, can or could produce, when Israel shall have changed its eternal vengeance into an eternal benediction for Europe, then that seventh day will once more appear, when the old Jewish God may rejoice in himself, in his creation, in his chosen people, and all of us will rejoice with him. This is the most profound and most radical statement on assimilation which I have read. And it was losing significance by the fact that Nietzsche's statement was not written without irony. In other words, he had no hopes in this respect. He only thought something through. Assimilation cannot mean abandoning the inheritance, but only giving it another direction, transforming it. And assimilation cannot be an end. It could only be a way toward that. Assimilation is an intermediate stage in which it means distinguishing oneself in pursuits which are not as such Jewish, but, as Nietzsche would say, European, as we would say, Western. After having received a notion of what assimilation at the highest could mean, and only in this way can we understand any assimilation, we must look at the actual assimilation. After one has heard such a passage, one trembles to look at the actual assimilation. There exists a kind of Jewish glorification of every clever or brilliant Jewish mediocrity, which is as pitiable as it is laughable. It reminds one of villagers who have produced their first physicist and hail him for this reason as the greatest physicist that ever was. I refuse to quote chapter and verse, but when I read statements in Jewish periodicals about Jewish celebrities, I'm always reminded of that. I became so distrustful of it at a time that I didn't believe that Einstein was of any significance. I'm not a theoretical physicist, and therefore I was as entitled to my opinion as any other ignorant. Then I asked a trustworthy friend of mine, a physicist, a Jew. I told him my opinion. I had the feeling that this is really a propaganda machine organized by Einstein's wife. I believe that was, by the way, true. I heard that she has that one. But then he told me, "You are mistaken." He was present at a seminar in Berlin, and that was tops in physics, and Planck, and also such men were present. And it was simply so. Einstein had the effect that he didn't know elementary mathematics. I mean, that was his general effect. But his conceits, his inventions, were surpassing that of all the others there. And he said, "You must believe he is really a first-rate physicist, and surely greatest physicist of this epoch." It is an empirical fact. So I accepted that. But I must say I'm still proud of my resistance, because this inclination to self-glorification in things in which there is no reason for self-glorification is a disgrace. That we have today so many outstanding Jews is due let us not deceive ourselves about that. To the general decline, to a general victory of mediocrity, it is today very easy to be a great man. among the blind, the one-eyed is king, is a proverb. I would like to emphasize this. Nietzsche's statement, which seems to be merely almost dithyrambic, is based on a very deep analysis, perhaps on the deepest analysis ever made of what assimilation could possibly mean. Now, the most patent effect of Nietzsche's analysis seems to me to be this: the regeneration or cleansing, which he had in mind as part of the process, proved to be insufficient as a work of individuals, however numerous or dedicated or gifted. It required and requires an act of national cleansing or purification. And this, in my mind, was the establishment of the State of Israel. Everyone who has seen Israel, nay, everyone who has witnessed the response to that act in New York, will understand what I mean. But this fact refutes Nietzsche's dream. For the establishment of the State of Israel means, while it may be in a way a progress in Jewish assimilation, as it surely is also a reassertion of the difference between Jews and non-Jews. If I say an act of assimilation, may I tell another story from my youth? I had a Jewish friend who was not a Zionist. His father was an old-fashioned liberal Jew. They called themselves in Germany German citizens of Jewish faith. That was the name. Do you remember that? But he said, when he goes to fetch his father from the synagogue and sees him together with his other assimilationist friends, and then he sees this young generation of Zionist boys, then he must admit this older generation, which is so un-Jewish by refusing any national character of Judaism, is much more Jewish than this young generation, which was so empirically Jewish. It's undeniable. Judaism is not a misfortune, to come back to my beginning, but, let us say, a heroic delusion. In what does this delusion consist? The one thing needful is righteousness or charity. That in Judaism is the same. This notion of the one thing needful is not defensible if the world is not the creation of the just and loving God, the holy God. The root of injustice and uncharitableness which abounds is not in God, but in the free acts of his creatures, in sin. The Jewish people and their fate are the living witness for the absence of redemption. This, one could say, is the meaning of the chosen people. The Jews are chosen to prove the absence of redemption. The greatest expression, surpassing everything any present-day man could write, is that great Jewish prayer, which will be known to some of you, and which is a stone, or a stumbling block to many. Aleinu Leshaber. I cannot, it would be absolutely improper for me to read it now. But let us reflect for one moment, for a few more moments, have this patience, about delusion. What is a delusion? We also say a dream. No nobler dream was ever dreamt. It is surely nobler to be victim of the most noble dream than to profit from a sordid reality and to wallow in it Dream is akin to aspiration, and aspiration is a kind of divination, of an enigmatic vision. And an enigmatic vision in the emphatic sense is a perception of the ultimate mystery, of the truth of the ultimate mystery. The truth of the ultimate mystery. The truth that there is an ultimate mystery, that being is radically mysterious, cannot be denied even by the unbelieving Jew of our age. That unbelieving Jew of our age, if he has any education, is ordinarily a positivist, a believer in science, and I believe he will be a believer in science, if not positivist, even without any education. As scientist, he must be concerned with the Jewish problem among innumerable other problems. He reduces the Jewish problem to something unrecognizable. Religious minorities, ethnic minorities, in other words, you can put together the characteristics of the Jewish problem by finding one element of it there, another element there. I'm speaking from experience. I had once a discussion with some social scientists in the presence of Rabbi Nicgorski where I saw how this was done. Oh, this is like the Parsis. This you find there. I forgot all the names. The unity, of course, was completely missed. The social scientist cannot see the phenomenon which he tries to diagnose or analyze as it is. His analysis is based on a superficial and thoughtless psychology or sociology. This sociology or psychology is superficial and thoughtless because it does not reflect on itself, on science itself. At the most, it raises the question, what is science? It is constitutionally unable to raise the question, why science? Nevertheless, whatever might follow from that, I must now, by God, come to a conclusion. Science, as a positivist understands it, is susceptible of infinite progress. That you learn in every elementary school today, I believe, that every result of science is provisional and subject to future revision, and that will never change. In other words, 50,000 years from now, there will still be results entirely different from those now, but still subject to revision. Science is susceptible of infinite progress. But how can science be susceptible of infinite progress if its object does not have an inner infinity? In other words, the object of science is everything that is being. So the belief admitted by all believers in science today that science is by its nature essentially progressive and eternally progressive implies, without saying it, that being is mysterious. And here is a point where the two lines which I've tried to trace do not meet, but where they come to some within hailing distance. And I believe to expect more in a general way of people in general would be unreasonable. I believe I have talked too much.